when I was a young lawyer, I was always impressed with the good judgment of juries. You know, in difficult cases, juries were able to sort out a lot of conflicting facts and come to a decision that lawyers on both sides could think of as dispositive of the issues. And I think today, many times the country wants to see a kind of an effort to reach on the big issues of the day some agreement and some consensus.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that in part what made the debate on the first Persian Gulf War so extraordinary? I mean, this really was Congress doing its job.
Yeah.
And what you said afterwards, after that vote, was probably the most important thing, which was, whatever the vote has decided, let's now get together. We are all behind our country and behind the president, behind the troops.
Well, and nobody really lost based on that vote in the next election.
No, I don't think that there was. I can't remember a single seat that was lost.
No one changed hands.
That was also
over that issue. It may have changed on other things, but not over that issue. Actually, I think that was one of the best debates in my experience, because we went all night long with members on both sides speaking.
Everybody got 5 minutes, didn't
Everybody
they?
got 5 minutes.
Yeah, there was no cutoff for debate.
Yeah.
And it was really an enlightened debate. I mean, it was a level that you really didn't see very often. You know what the public doesn't see is the groundwork that helps produce that.
Yeah, that's true.
The meetings that you and Bob Michael would have, the meetings you had with both Democratic and Republican leaders of the Senate, sometimes over there, sometimes in your office. I mean, there's a lot of groundwork you seem to put in to make these things come across. Yeah.
Sometimes I think there's too harsh a message delivered when people give these 1-minute speeches at the beginning of the day and sort of on the attack mode. And
well, you have to almost to give it 1 minute. I mean, you have to say something right sharp up front to get any attention.
But it kind of gives the impression of the two parties at loggerheads, and to a degree it's increasingly, unfortunately, a real impression. But there was also the behind-the-scenes efforts of the party leadership to work together. And particularly when I was Speaker, I had the great pleasure and honor of having Bob Michael, who was the Republican leader, and I think one of the really extraordinary members of Congress in my experience. He was a strong defender of the Republican position. He was not in any way reluctant to take a tough argument and a tough debate to the floor, and sometimes was successful. Not always was the majority something that could be accomplished without some concession on our part. So I thought he was a very effective leader, but he was also one who always kind of put the interest of the country first. And when we were voting in the first Gulf War vote, I voted against the resolution and Bob voted for it. And later on, when it was passed, I think about a third of the votes came from the Democratic side. We let every member make his or her own decision. We voted virtually unanimously to support the decision the Congress had made and to support the President as Commander-in-Chief and the troops in the field, if they should ever be in the field. And that, I think, was the coming together you mentioned. But he came up to the podium where I was sitting. Bob always wore the infantryman's combat infantry badge very proudly. He was a proud infantry soldier in the Second World War. And he's a big, tough guy. And he had tears in his eyes. And he said that, you know, this was the hardest vote he thinks he'd cast as long as he'd been in Congress, because he realized that by casting it, he may be putting young men and women in harm's way. And that's a terrible and difficult responsibility. And he thought it was the right thing to do, and he was doing it without regret, but he also worried about what would be the consequence. And the fact that he had that feeling, I think, was an enormous testament to Bob, not just as a good member, but as a real human being, knowing that some of the decisions that you make in Congress or in government have consequences for people, sometimes very, very life-changing consequences. But it's one of the things you can't escape. The first Gulf War was, of course, accomplished very quickly, and after the war was over and the Iraqi forces were expelled from Kuwait, and the achievements of the purpose of the war had been realized, there was a question of whether they should pursue Saddam Hussein back to Baghdad and overthrow the regime. And the decision President Bush 41 made was not to do that. And I remember supporting that decision at the time, saying that I thought that he was right to make the decision based on achieving the objects of the UN resolution and the objects of American forces and the coalition forces, and not to move in and take over the regime with all the possible consequences. I think we are seeing some of those consequences today in Iraq, and whatever anybody's opinion is of the war, it was something that I think was foreseen as a possibility in 1991.